Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are once again going to talk on Marxist theory of Indian state. We have covered in two lectures in elaborative way on the following topic, and today is the concluding lecture where we are going to give you in-depth knowledge once again. Friends, for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Friends, if you wish to ask questions from Dr. Satish Kumar Jha on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. Friends, if you have seen our previous two lectures on Marxist theory of Indian state, then also you can ask questions pertaining to the previous two lectures, as this is the continuation on the previous sessions too. So friends, let's welcome our guest Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, and let's try to have a vivacious session once again. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetika ji, and good afternoon. In fact, today is the third and the concluding lecture on a three-part series on Marxist theory of Indian state. In fact, in the last two lectures we have dealt with two important issues. One, that how the state comes into the entire frame of Marxist theory, and number two, the how Marxist theory has tried to deal with the Indian state. In this context, we had also looked at the theoretical debate within Marxism, particularly with reference to the instrumentalist and relative autonomist view, particularly what I put it at the Communist Manifesto view and the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte's position on the state, particularly with reference to relative autonomy of a state. I also mentioned that how academic discourse in India, particularly within the Marxist, among the Marxist scholars, has of late brought into discussion some of the theoretical issues which were debated in West, particularly Western Marxism in 60s and 70s, and in that context I have referred to Miliband-Pollinger debate on instrumentalist versus relative autonomy issue, and at the same time also the contributions of Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci, particularly his concept of hegemony and passive revolution. Along with this, we also mentioned that how this entire discussion of Indian state within the this Marxist frame gets confined to the discussion of the nature of the state power in India, the nature of ruling class, the composition of ruling class, and so on and so forth. So therefore, in fact, this entire discussion got divided into two camps: the party ideologues, or one can say the party position, the various communist parties of India which subscribes to Marxist theory and Marxist ideology, as well as the academic discourse in social science which subscribes to the Marxist theory, but one can put them as a freelancer in terms of their commitment, because they are not affiliated to, many of them were not affiliated to any communist party, but nonetheless tried to understand Indian situation through Marxist theory and Marxist framework. So therefore, this division was there, the party line and the academic line, and we tried to discuss this thing in our last lecture, that is second part of our discussion, that how this party line and the academic line was different, because the party line essentially was orthodox classical Marxist position on a state, that a state is nothing but the instrument of the ruling class, whereas the party line in fact the academic line a little bit became more nuanced and also deviated from this position and tried to factorize number of factors, number of elements into their analysis, including the specificity of Indian social formation, nature of Indian society, the caste system, culture, religion, and predominance of many other factors which perhaps the Marxist theory would like to call superstructural factors according to their base superstructure analysis. So therefore, the academic discourse was basically more nuanced. It enriched this entire whole corpus of writings which can be considered as the Marxist writings on Indian state or Indian politics. So this is something we should remember. Now, one thing is very important to recall here, that how this communist movement looked at this entire evolution of the Indian politics after 1947, or one can say that Indian state. In fact, here we do well to remember that the communist movement during freedom movement was also dealing with the imperialism and the colonial state. But after independence, they did not make much distinction between what colonial state was doing and what the post independent Indian state was all about. And therefore, I mentioned that the initial slogan of the Communist Party, that Azadi jhuti hai, this entire independence is false and fake, characterized their political position, and instead of believing in the constitutional discourse, or one can say the values and the principles which India's constitution upheld, they believed in the social struggles. They believe in the struggle of peasants and workers, and therefore this Telangana movement and Tevhaga movement, the two powerful peasant movements which were basically led by the Communist Party at the time of independence, that tells us that how they looked at Indian politics at that time. But at the same time, as we had discussed in our earlier lecture, that later on the kind of transformation through which the Indian communist movement went through, that is also quite significant. For example, I mentioned that Indian Communist Party was the first communist party in the world which came to power through electoral means, through parliamentary politics. So therefore, a new chapter started, that is the parliamentary politics of Indian communist parties, and therefore the first elected communist government which came into power was in Kerala, headed by Nambudiri Pal, who was not a leader of the Communist Party in the communist movement, was also a great ideologue and a very creative and imaginative thinker. So therefore, this Nambudiri Pal became the first elected chief minister under communist regime in Kerala, and that was the beginning of the transformation of the entire communist politics, and one can say that transformation from a struggle to parliamentary politics. Now, of course, I also mentioned that how subsequently Communist Party witnessed many split in the United Communist Party when two political parties came out of this, CPI and CPI-M, and then subsequently within CPI-M also there was a split when CPI Marxist-Leninist ML came out of this, and subsequently ML of course has had many splits and many groups in that name. So therefore, this is how the communist movement developed. But one thing which I mentioned earlier also, and I will repeat today, that their analysis of Indian state got frozen in time. Because one thing is very important for Marxist theory of a state, to identify two things: the nature of social formation, the nature of mode of production, and the nature of ruling class. And accordingly, as per the terms of reference of this theory, Marxist theory, so far as the communist parties, the parties were concerned, they were busy identifying three things: what is the nature of mode of production in India, what is the nature of ruling class, and as I mentioned that essentially they believed in the coalitional logic of ruling class, like many academicians who subsequently built their theory on this class coalition, be it Pranab Bardhan, Sudip Kaviraj or many others. But the Communist parties essentially believed that the two important dominant classes, the erstwhile landlords in the countryside and the big bourgeoisie, they were ruling the Indian state. So Indian state was instrument in the hands of these two classes. Of course, later on third element was brought into this alliance or this coalition, that was a global capital, or one can say that comprador bourgeoisie, that was not national but global. So therefore, but nonetheless essentially they focused on these two classes. They believed that land reforms, entire slogan of land reforms was a sham. A state was simply working to promote capitalism in India, and therefore it is a bourgeois state, or some groups call it bourgeois landlord state. So this was the party position. Why I call it that frozen in time? Because they did not identify or they did not recognize many changes which were taking place here. It is also to be remembered, as I mentioned earlier also, that Marxist theory essentially applies to capitalist social formation, because this is something which perhaps Marx more adequately analyzed and explained, that is the capitalism and capitalist social formation. 20 long years he has spent studying capitalism. But one thing is to remember that India was not a classical land of capitalism. Because of number of factors. Colonialism itself was responsible for it. As I mentioned earlier, that the debate on mode of production basically brought out this issue very sharply, that how India's mode of production was a hybrid in nature. In fact, combination of feudal and the capitalist elements existed here. So, therefore, the mixed character of India's social formation and the mode of production basically necessitated a different type of handling or different type of analysis, and therefore, what we find that this entire characterization of Indian state as a capitalist state, they were also perhaps not convinced. That is why they perhaps at times brought in this alliance partner of landlord, sometimes brought in something else, but nonetheless they believed in an instrumentalist position, and communist parties were not ready to revise this position even till recently, particularly the post 91 economic reforms era, which I will be discussing at the end of our discussion today. In fact, they are struggling to come to terms with the changes and transformations which the Indian state and Indian political institutions have undergone. The nature of the nature and character of different classes, one can say within Marxist parlance, the nature and character of ruling class in India has also been changing, but the communist parties are totally bedeviled to basically deal with these transformations. And it is here that I mentioned that academic discourse or academic Marxist analysis has played important role, which has basically not only enriched this entire analysis, but has brought out new dimensions to this entire discourse, that how Indian politics has been passing through number of changes. And it is in this context I mentioned that 2-3 important theoretical innovations which happened, or one can say the 2-3 important theoretical churnings which happened in the West perhaps contributed to it. One was, as I mentioned, Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci's and his prison notebooks, particularly on basis of prison notebooks, the way Gramsci theorized about hegemony, which is a combination of coercion and consent, that how the state develops legitimacy for itself and how the ruling class plays important role. And Althusser, particularly the structuralist Marxist, who talked about over-determination, that it is not only the economic structure which determines this nature of state institutions and state power or social formation, but number of factors come into play, and therefore, what results ultimately is the over-determined structure when number of causalities happen. So, therefore, Althusser-Gramsci combination, theoretical combination, perhaps in fact enriched this Marxist theory both in the West as well as among Indian Marxist scholars. And it is in this context I mentioned that the 70s and 80s we find flowering of Marxist academic writings and academic thinking and academic discourse on Indian state. And it is in this context I had mentioned the name of Sudipta Kaviraj, Partha Chatterjee, Pranab Bardhan, and then many others like Shrikant Dutt and Achin Binayak, and maybe we can go on adding names. But at the same time, I had also mentioned that K.N. Raj getting influence from Kaleki, particularly through his concept of intermediate regime, that this entire world is not divided into two camps, the socialist regimes and the capitalist regimes, but there are regimes which could be called and characterized as intermediate regimes falling between the two and with some characteristics, and India was basically called intermediate regime, not necessarily a bourgeois capitalist state, the way perhaps the communist parties were calling earlier. So, therefore, and the context in which this CP issue after Khrushchev perhaps revised its position, and accordingly perhaps CPI, Communist Party of India, also revised its position. So, these things were happening also in the global communist movement, but in academic discourse Kaleki's contribution was significant, and K.N. Raj basically applied that thing in Indian context, that how India is a in case of intermediate regime because of number of factors, as I discussed in my earlier lecture, because of state intervention in economy through a very large public sector, numerical dominance of the lower middle class at the time of independence, availability of credit from the socialist societies, a state was playing a dynamic role and was basically an entrepreneur, and therefore, there was amalgamation of the interest of the lower middle class with state capitalism in India. So, this is how this new analysis, new explanation was offered by K.N. Raj influenced by CEC. So, this was something important, but the most significant contribution I was mentioning was basically this writings which came in 70s and 80s, particularly in 80s, and it is here that Sudit Kaviraj and Partha Chatterjee's writings become important. It is here the Pranab Bardhan's writings become important, particularly political economy of development, where he built this entire argument for coalition, nature of the classes. At the same time, he put forth an argument for the relative autonomy of the state, which we discussed in our earlier lectures, that how this relative autonomy was posited, how this relative autonomy of Indian state was highlighted. Unlike the orthodox classical line that state was an instrument in the hands of ruling class, and in Indian context the ruling class composed of the landlords and the national bourgeoisie. So, therefore, this new argument was that a state was relatively autonomous, and they said that this analysis itself was Marxian, particularly relying on 18th Brumaire writing of Karl Marx, when he talked about relative autonomy of the state. Now, what happened that in this context, three important sources one can say. One is of course theoretical inspiration, one can say Gramsci, Althusser, and also CEC, particularly intermediate regime, which K.N. Raj talked of, but also certain other developments which were happening in area of political economy and comparative politics, particularly in terms of coalition building, particularly after the writings of Olson and others. So, therefore, this Pranab Bardhan, when talked about relative autonomy of a state, he also talked about the coalitional nature of ruling class, and it is to be remembered that even the communist parties were talking about coalition, but their entire analysis of coalition was different, because they also believed that India did not have bourgeois revolution like classical capital bourgeois revolution of the West, be it France, England or United States of America, and therefore the the national bourgeoisie was weak, and therefore it was not in a position to wield a state power. Hence, it required the support of other alliance partners, and landlords, the erst landlords of the countryside became the partner in this game. So, therefore, Indian ruling class comprised of two things, this industrial, the national bourgeoisie, and the rural landlords, or one can say the landed interests. So, therefore, they also talked of coalition, but this coalition was different. But here, in fact, this entire analysis of Pranab Bardhan and others, this entire coalitional argument was basically put forth in a different frame. They talked about bureaucratic elites. They talked of this intelligentsia as part of this ruling class. In fact, Ashok Rudra wrote a whole paper on this, how intelligentsia is a ruling class in India. So, therefore, their discussion of coalition was different from what perhaps the communist parties were discussing in terms of characterizing the coalitional nature of the ruling class. But one thing is important, that the transformations which were happening in 60s and 70s, till 80s were major transformations, and those transformations, of course, the communist parties were analyzing. For example, one thing we should remember, that what happened, that when the transition took place from Nehruvian era to Indira Gandhi's era, particularly in mid 60s, in fact, there was a lot of churning taking place within the Marxist camp, so far as nature of Indian politics is concerned. In fact, the communist parties itself got divided on this issue. For example, the Communist Party of India went to the extent of supporting emergency in 1975 when Mrs. Indira Gandhi promulgated it. It supported emergency because it thought that it was essentially meant to checkmate the rightist forces who were trying to basically oppose the progressive policies of Mrs. Indira Gandhi, particularly the policy of abolition of privy purses, Garibi Hatao, bank nationalization. All of them were socialistic in tone and nature, and therefore the rightist forces were taking on her, and therefore the communist parties extended support to Mrs. Gandhi. Now, this left populism of Mrs. Indira Gandhi got support from the left, including the support of emergency by CPI. Later on, of course, the Communist Party of India, that is CPI, regretted its decision of support of the emergency, but nonetheless the fact is that this was something which is very important so far as the the understanding of Indian state and politics among the Marxist scholars and the Communist Party is concerned. Now, what happened that academic discourse around the same time, or one can say later, looked at these developments in a different frame. They looked at it perhaps in a more nuanced manner, and it is here that Sudip Kavira's writing becomes important. Particularly the piece which he wrote in Economic and Political Weekly of a passive revolution in India, a critique, calling what happened in India as a case of passive revolution, drawing on the writings of Antonio Gramsci, that how in those societies where the bourgeoisie was weak, where the societies which did not witness the bourgeois revolution the way perhaps the classical land of capitalism witnessed, be it United Kingdom, Britain, France or United States of America. So, in these societies what happened, that Gramsci believes that capitalism develops through passive revolution, and passive revolution is basically revolution which is basically spearheaded, or one can say that is done at the behest of state institutions and at the behest of the bureaucratic elites, and therefore, it is from above, not from the below. So, therefore, this passive revolution, for example, Italy and Germany, the two cases which were perhaps at the back of Gramsci's mind, because unlike other West European countries, Italy and Germany did not have a classic bourgeois revolution, and therefore, the capitalism was sought to be developed by a more powerful authoritarian state. So, therefore, drawing inspiration from such writings, some Marxist scholars in India started explaining Indian politics and the nature of Indian state within this frame of passive revolution, and also this coalitional nature of ruling class, where the bourgeoisie was weak and some other classes were playing important role, including a bureaucratic managerial elite. So, basically this is something important, that how it explains from Nehru period to Mrs. Indira Gandhi's period. But then this was not enough. Later transformations perhaps put question mark on the relevance of this passive revolution model, and it is here Partha Chatterjee becomes important. So, we have to discuss both the passive revolution and the subsequent transformation.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so much for giving us this session on Marxist theory of Indian state. Dear friends, there is a lot more for you. You are requested to be with us as we are back after a short break. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on Marxist theory of Indian state. This is the last session in the series, and we are going to give you more and more of knowledge. The concluding lecture will of course help us out in understanding the topic in detail. Friends, for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Dear friends, we believe that you might have questions pertaining to this 3 lecture based series. If you wish to ask questions, then do call us through our toll free number. Our number is 1800110430. I repeat, our number is 1800110430. Now I would like to welcome our guest Dr. Jha once again and would request him to continue further. Hello sir, welcome back.
Thank you. In fact, continuing from where we had left in the last session, that how the transformation of Indian politics, Indian economy in post 90s period have raised lot of issues and questions before the Marxist scholars and the practitioners of the Marxist politics, that is the communist parties, various factions of the communist parties. And accordingly, they are basically struggling to come to terms with the new changes, particularly after economic reforms of 1991, which is called neoliberal reforms. But what we find, that the communist party is related essentially to the global dominance of the finance capitalism in name of globalization, and therefore basically erosion of the autonomy which some of the ruling classes enjoyed in the earlier era in various satellite countries like India, and therefore they believe that it is the sway of finance capital. But then of course the specificity of some of the societies like India, as earlier they perhaps failed to analyze adequately, perhaps the similar thing can be said even today, because perhaps they are not being able to come to terms with the changes which Indian society, Indian economy and Indian polity are witnessing, be it this erosion of the legitimacy of a state, be it the popularity of the market mechanism, be it the ascendant new Indian middle class which is gradually getting integrated within the global community, or one can say the rise of right wing nationalism and many other similar things. So therefore what has happened, that they are basically faced with number of challenges, and therefore they are grappling with the crisis which surrounds them, and that is best reflected in their electoral setbacks from state after state. Particularly they have lost power in Bengal, they have lost power in Tripura, and perhaps the 2 important states where they were ruling for quite some time. So therefore this is something about the crisis, or one can say the dilemma under which this Indian communist parties, the practitioners of Marxist politics, are perhaps grappling with. The academic discourse also now of course is also facing a problem. As I mentioned earlier, that many scholars including Partha Chatterjee argues that the passive revolution framework given by Sudip Kaviraj was a very helpful tool to understand Indian politics, the nature of Indian state, nature of Indian ruling class for 50s, 60s and 70s till 80s. But the post economic reforms era has basically made this passive revolution analysis inadequate, not totally redundant but inadequate, because there are certain changes which it does not explain. So therefore he tries to give his explanation, he tries to analyze the post 91 changes through through a binary which he has basically created between civil society, a split between civil society and political society, where in political society people are treated as population, whereas in civil society people are treated as citizens. Civil society is characterized by legality, whereas political society is characterized by illegality. Political society is characterized also by democracy, whereas the civil society is characterized by this modernity. So all these things are there. We will be touching on some of the issues, that how Partha Chatterjee claims that this framework is more adequate to deal with the changes of post 1991 situation, be it the nature of class, be it ruling class, be it the nature of a state power, or be it the nature of capital. So, therefore, this is something important, but before we come to that issue post 91, in fact, I was discussing in the last session about 50s and 60s, particularly the politics in India, and how Sudip Kaviraj and many other scholars have talked about the coalition nature of ruling class and the passive revolution in India. What is passive revolution? That I also tried to explain, that it is basically drawn from the writings of Antonio Gramsci, Italian Marxist philosopher, who called passive revolution as a block dialectics. I mentioned that how some of the countries in Europe, particularly Italy and Germany, which did not witness capitalism or the bourgeois revolution like Britain, France and other countries, they basically had to rely on through other mode for the development of capitalism. In my earlier lecture, I had also mentioned Barrington Moore Jr. and his that celebrated writing, Social Origin of Dictatorship and Democracy, where he had talked about three routes to capitalism. On the one hand, he had argued that no bourgeoisie, no democracy. Without bourgeoisie, you cannot have liberal democracy. On the other hand, he also tried to explain that how United States of America, France and Britain, this combination of class forces, particularly the bourgeoisie and the entire revolution, paved the way for capitalism. Similarly, he dealt with the question of China and Russia, that how peasants because for Barrington Moore, settlement or settlement of the peasant question is important issue for democracy. If peasantry continues to exist, then it creates hurdles for democracy, for development of democracy. So, therefore, Russia and China, that how peasant question was dealt with under through collectivization. In classical land of capitalism, it was dealt with through enclosure movement and number of means. When it came to India, of course, I mentioned that even Barrington Moore Jr. believed that it was a case of puzzle, because peasants continued to exist and liberal democratic institutions were continuing to develop, and therefore, he attributed it to India's national movement, India's Congress party, the role of the middle class and so on and so forth. But Germany and Italy, even Barrington Moore talked about a situation where capitalism was developed from top, from the above. So, what I am trying to mention here, that this passive revolution phenomenon particularly is about those societies where capitalism did not develop through natural process, and therefore, it was sought to be developed at the behest of the state. Now, drawing inspiration from this theory of Antonio Gramsci, in fact, Sudip Kaviraj tries to deal with this question in Indian context, that how India's case fits into this frame of passive revolution, because what happened under Nehru, what happened under Mrs. Indira Gandhi, what happened under Rajiv Gandhi, according to Sudip Kaviraj, was nothing but a case of passive revolution, because the bourgeoisie were weak, in fact, and therefore, what happened, that this weak bourgeoisie was not in a position to develop capitalism, and therefore, state took upon its shoulder the responsibility to develop capitalism. According to Sudip Kaviraj, the features of passive revolution during Nehruvian era were that how land reforms got aborted, because land reform was not completed because of the vested interests which the countryside had, or perhaps the Congress social base among former landlords, and therefore, these regional leaders did not allow the land reforms to succeed. Number 2, the bureaucratization of state machinery and the economic means. Number 3, that how this cooperative revolution led to the exodus of peasantry and the reaction among certain sections, particularly how the Chaudhry Charan Singh led Kishan movement in UP, and then the Swatantra party by Rajaji was formed, and so many other things. So, basically he deals with number of events of that period and says that what happened, that the symptoms of passive revolution could be seen here. Number 1, the land reforms was not accomplished. Number 2, bureaucratization of the entire state machinery was done, and similar other things one can go on citing that how this passive revolution was accomplished. But not only that, Nehruvian period, which perhaps confused many observers in the communist world. Many observers who were basically inclined towards a Marxist analysis because of the predominance of public sector, non-aligned movement which was not aligned to either camps, declaration of the goal for India as a socialist pattern of society in Awadi Congress, and so many other things. So, it was very difficult at that time to call India as a purely a capitalist state or Nehruvian state as a bourgeois state, and therefore, this Khrushchev's and the CPSU revised its position. Therefore, perhaps this intermediate regime of Kaleki and K.N. Raj perhaps served this purpose. But what happened that 60s and after transition from Nehru to Indira Gandhi created more problem. What happened that this Nehru Mahalanobis model of development as it was perhaps in existence in 50s and 60s, early 60s till Nehru was alive. In fact, during Indira Gandhi's time, it moved in another direction. This is what called a license permit Raj, and therefore, what happened that on the one hand that state bureaucratic elite became more important as part of this ruling coalition. And number two, a number of left populist measures were taken. For example, abolition of privy purses, Garibi Hatao, bank nationalization, and so on and so forth. And I mentioned earlier that that created not only a problem within the Congress party, the split between the syndicate and the indicate, but also among communist parties, because the Communist Party of India supported this, saying that it was a real well intentioned move to bring in socialism or to take on the rightist forces. So, therefore, what happened that this was the beginning of a new series of crises which basically erupted gradually in Indian politics, and declaration of emergency of 1975 was the high point, because what happened that emergency became the landmark in terms of the analysis of Indian state so far as the Marxist camp is concerned. I mentioned earlier that Communist Party of India supported emergency. Later on, of course, it regretted its decision, supported on this premise that it was essentially meant to deal with the challenge which was being thrown by the rightist forces against the socialist measures initiated by Mrs. Indira Gandhi. But nonetheless, one thing is important, that this emergency and the analysis of emergency in India, which was of course declared as per the constitutional mandate, has given a very lively debate among both party ideologues and the academicians, and it is in this context that this passive revolution of Sudipta Kaviraj also becomes significant, because Sudipta Kaviraj starts with the Nehruvian period and then perhaps goes on to this emergency period. In fact, he also wrote a paper, Indira Gandhi and Emergency, on the pages of Economic and Political Weekly. So, this bureaucratic elite became this important element in this ruling coalition and ruling bloc, which earlier, as I mentioned, that the communist parties were only including the landlords and the bourgeoisie, or the different sections of bourgeoisie, or multiple sections of the rural rich. But here this new crucial element became the bureaucratic elite in this concept of ruling bloc, which Kaviraj used along with this passive revolution to explain that Indian politics from Nehru period to Mrs. Indira Gandhi period. In fact, Kaviraj went to the extent of saying that this Patel-Nehru debate, which is often highlighted, that had Patel been at the helm of affairs, things would have been different. Kaviraj does not agree with that explanation. He said that both were basically geared towards capitalism, both wanted to develop capitalism in India. The difference was that their routes would have been different. Nehru's route was through a state, perhaps Patel would have chosen a different route to develop capitalism. So, therefore, whatever tussle they had, it was a tussle of personality, but not tussle of goals, and therefore, this is something significant in context of what he tries to argue, that essentially what was being sought to be done in India was promotion of capitalism. And here there is no difference between the party line and the academic line. The difference is that party line believes that this was very linear, smooth development of capitalism, whereas these academic oriented Marxist theoreticians and scholars they perhaps tries to look at it, they try to look at it in a different frame. They try to look at it, for example, Vyas looks at it in frame of passive revolution, that how this was being done at the behest of the state, that is the bureaucratic elite, and perhaps with the help of the state institutions, not at the behest of the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie. Now, what happened at 60s? The parting of ways by the socialists, when the Lohia and others became more vocal and started mobilizing countryside. The peasant revolutions in countryside, particularly the Naxalite movement and other things, along with the peasant, this I had mentioned the cooperative movement, or particularly the Nehru period, this cooperative initiative for cooperative, how perhaps put off Rajaji and how led to the formation of Swatantra Party, and also the exodus of the rich peasants from the Congress, Charan Singh and others, how they left Congress and formed their own political groups. So, therefore, these changes were happening in Indian politics, and therefore, gradually because this green revolution, which is a very important development in Indian economy and Indian politics, which is perhaps also factorized by these academic Marxist scholars. The green revolution perhaps created a new ascendant vocal class in the countryside. Now, after acquiring economic prowess, they also developed political ambition, and therefore, they got mobilized outside Congress, and therefore, what happened, that 1967 debacle of Congress is explained by Vyas and many other with reference to this new ascendant class in the countryside, which later became part of this ruling coalition, which earlier comprised only of the national bourgeoisie, the former erstwhile landlords or the landed interest in countryside, and the bureaucratic elite. Now, there was a third component, which is this the rural rich, agrarian bourgeoisie, which in fact Achin Binayak, another Marxist scholar, goes to the extent saying that this coalition, this agrarian bourgeoisie is perhaps the most important element. In fact, it plays a more important role than perhaps its economic strength and perhaps size would ask for. So, therefore, this is something important, that how green revolution transformed this entire scenario. The Congress lost to power in 67, and then of course, Mrs. Indira Gandhi's ascendancy and the left populism. Now, this left populism ultimately culminated into this emergency, where she basically talked about this rightist challenge on her left oriented policies and goals, and it is on this basis perhaps one of the Communist Party, that is Communist Party of India, also supported it. Now, what happened, that the crisis of legitimacy which the Indian ruling class faced, the crisis of legitimacy which Indian state faced, perhaps was not discussed by the communist parties. Even if they discussed in a very simplistic fashion. But these academic Marxist scholars provided a more nuanced explanation for this crisis of legitimacy, and therefore, what happened, that Sudit Kaviraj argues that this crisis of legitimacy which this ruling class was facing in late 60s intensified the passive revolution features of Nehruvian era. Rather, in fact, they brought this entire passive revolution features to new height, and therefore, what happened, that the two important groups which became ascendant in this period. One is the rural peasantry, that is the rich peasantry which I mentioned, the rural rich, and another was the regional bourgeoisie, who were playing a very subordinate role in earlier era. So, regional bourgeoisie and the rich peasants, they were new entrants into this ruling coalition, along with the earlier players of this ruling coalition, bureaucratic elite, the national bourgeoisie and the landlords. So, therefore, this squabbles within this ruling coalition among these partners was from time to time creating problem. Crisis of legitimacy for a state, crisis of legitimacy for institutions, even this entire regional movements which gradually unfolded in various states on state autonomy within the federal framework, but some of them became secessionist in orientation, like Assam movement, the Ashu movement, or the this Akali movement in Punjab, or the many other similar movements which erupted. Kaviraj tries to deal with or looks at this thing, eruption of the regional autonomy movement, as the rise and ascendancy of the regional bourgeoisie and the rise of the rural rich. So, these two new entrants into this ruling coalition created a new crisis for this entire frame of passive revolution which was going on in India since Nehru period. Now, what happened, that the conclusion which Kaviraj draws through his analysis of passive revolution is saying that Indian politics was witnessing a structural crisis, and this crisis was not because capitalism was not able to develop adequately, but precisely because of the manner of its growth, because the way, the route which it chose to grow, the method through which capitalism was sought to be developed and promoted in India, that is the passive revolution mode, that is the passive revolution route, and therefore, this structural crisis was basically there. Of course, this transitional flux in these societies where pre-colonial, colonial in fact was yet and the post-colonial was yet to be developed in a authentic modernity. So, therefore, this transitional flux has been explained by many other scholars with the Marxist frame. But what Kaviraj says, that this entire crisis in Indian politics was structural. Whatever happened within Congress party was symptomatic of this crisis, where the ruling coalition was witnessing a kind of squabbles, a internal tension, largely because of their participation and share in the cake. So, therefore, what happened, that for Kaviraj it was a passive revolution model which can be which can explain Indian situation, because the crisis was structural, but it was not because that capitalism was not able to develop adequately, rather capitalism was developing here, but through a different route. That route was the passive revolution route, which perhaps Gramsci explains in context of Italy and Germany, and therefore, the authoritarianism of emergency was also explained as a basically mechanism to sort out some of the symptoms of this crisis, and therefore, authoritarianism of emergency was a natural fallout of this entire route which was adopted, that is the passive revolution route. So, therefore, this is the Gramscian frame applied by Sudip Kaviraj to explain India's state and the nature of state power and the nature of the ruling class in India. In fact, of course, later on he also argued that even the Gramscian passive revolution was not being successful in India, but rather it was lapsing into failure, because even that was not being done properly. So, therefore, in fact, what has happened, that whatever structural crisis Indian society and Indian politics were witnessing was because of the success of Indian capitalism, and therefore, it was a crisis of the ruling bloc, and therefore, a ruling bloc which violated the essential protocol which should govern their functioning. So, this in nutshell, in fact, one can say that Sudip Kaviraj analyzes this entire thing in this frame. I mentioned about Achin Binayak, particularly his writing Painful Transition in 1991, and in that book he talks of a dominant coalition like Bardhan and Kaviraj, but of course, he gives more importance to the agrarian bourgeoisie. In fact, he also argues that no classical bourgeois revolution could take place in India, and therefore, in fact, the system was gaining lot of legitimacy in the eyes of the people, and therefore, in fact, the political form of this system was bourgeois, and legitimacy and autonomous nature of this state power were also highlighted by Binayak in his writing. Now, coming to Partha Chatterjee, about whom I mentioned that initially, like Kaviraj, Bardhan and others, he talked about a ruling coalition in India, moving away from the analysis of the communist parties. But Partha Chatterjee later, particularly in 90s, after economic reforms were initiated during Narasimha Rao's period, in fact, has perhaps more intensely looked at this entire unfolding of scenario, and therefore, he also argues that the passive revolution model, which was very useful to understand Indian state, Indian ruling class in 50s, 60s, 70s till 80s, was proving inadequate. So, then what is the way out? And therefore, he says that now perhaps the Marxist theory requires a new lens to look at the Indian politics and Indian state. Now, this new lens is basically required largely on account of the erosion of license permit Raj in era of economic reforms. What has happened that many more entrance to this capitalist class at different level has happened in India, and therefore, one cannot simply get confined to agrarian bourgeoisie, that is the rural rich, landlords and national bourgeoisie. Rather, the peasants, which were a very vocal section of this ruling class, has completely got demoralized in India after economic reforms. Today, the same countryside which witnessed powerful farmers movement is witnessing farmer suicide, and therefore, the kind of agrarian distress today the countryside is facing symbolizes this transformation. Now, he mentions some of those changes. The first change in post 1991 period, which necessitates a new frame to deal with Indian state, the nature of Indian state from the point of view of Marxist theory. He says that number one is the ascendancy of the corporate capitalist class compared to the landed elites, and therefore, what happened that the earlier vocal agrarian bourgeoisie has completely flattened. Number two, this ascendancy has not come through elections, but rather it has come through economic reforms, which has been called by one political economist Jenkins as reforms by stealth. The second is the erosion of license permit Raj. Third is that the managerial the bureaucratic managerial class and the kind of role it was playing earlier in passive revolution frame has declined considerably. And next is the autonomy of a state in relation to the dominant class is completely getting redefined. Along with, there are certain other factors. The kind of legitimacy a state enjoys, that is completely eroded. The bureaucratic elite no longer perhaps enjoys the same legitimacy, and the symptom of this crisis can be seen in anti-corruption movement in India, which challenges the legitimacy of a state. The urban middle class particularly has been questioning this state and demands open market mechanism and believes in the miracle of the market. So, therefore, what happens that these transformations have completely made redundant the earlier analysis, and therefore, in fact, he talks about a new phenomenon where there are two societies existing in India, the civil society and political society. In all lands of classical bourgeois revolution, you have had the civil society, but here say that in these transitional flux or in transitional societies, there is another sphere which is a political society. Civil society is the realm of modernity, political society is the realm of democracy. Civil society, according to Partha Chatterjee, acts in India in post 1991 period at the realm of legality, where people are recognized as citizens, where political society acts as a realm of illegality, where people are treated as population, and therefore, only negotiation works, not the politics in the normal sense of the term. So, therefore, this political society and civil society are the new categories devised by Partha Chatterjee to understand the transformation of state and politics in India, and therefore, this is perhaps a very recent analysis that how Marxist theory should look at it. Perhaps by Partha Chatterjee, many people would not recognize him as a true Marxist voice, but nonetheless his past has been colored by this theory and this ideology, along with certain new genres of writing which are emerging to look at the everyday functioning of the state. Scholars like Dipankar Gupta, Tarlow, Fuller and Burney, these are the scholarly writings coming to come to terms with the working of Indian state in day-to-day life. So, this is how perhaps this entire thing goes on.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so much for giving us this session. Friends, thank you for watching us.